All right. Awesome. Jeff, thanks for gathering here. I'm super excited to talk to you about Butterfly Lab. It's been a minute. And I know you've been on a really intense book tour for a little while. So I appreciate you finding some time at the end of the tour, as you said, to be able to sit down and like dig deep. I guess it's not that deep. It's only like a few years old. Since we were going in the thick of the Butterfly Lab together. But as you know, like it's a program that was like really influential to me and not just to the project that we brought through it, the Muslim Futures Anthology, but also just in terms of like the way that I think about culture making and the way that I think about, the opportunities to marry like really thoughtful, hard audience research and narrative strategy with culture making. And so as we're now in the process of getting ready to launch the Muslim Futures Anthology, I was super excited to get back on the horn with you and just kind of like revisit like that journey and especially talk a little bit about kind of the origins of the program because it came into fruition. It came into being before, like well before I was involved in it. And so from my perspective, it'll be cool actually to hear about some of the origins and what went into the program before I was even involved with it. Um, so thanks for doing this.
Oh, thank you for having me. So it's always great to hang out with you for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start at the beginning, I guess. Why don't we I mean, I when I talk about the program and the projects that came through it, one of the most like interesting things about it is that the program, well, not one of the most interesting things, but I think one of the most surprising things is the project originated in within Race Forward, because I think a lot of people don't know about a lot of the sort of narrative arts and culture strategy work that Race Forward does. I think like they're known for a lot of different kind of work. And so I think like it might be useful just to kind of talk through like what were the origins of the program? How did it come about through Race Forward? And how did you get involved with it?
Sure. So I mean, it really predates Race Forward getting involved in narrative arts and culture.
Hmm.
It really goes back to um, I could take it all the way back to the turn of the millennium, and this sort of generational kind of shift in the movement and thinking about how to understand the role of culture in movements, in social movements. I think the generation previous to us uh, had kind of an understanding of culture as downstream from politics, um, and uh, and I think there's a lot of theoretical reasons for that. There's a lot of actual political reasons for that. There's a lot of ways that we can understand it within you know the histories of um, of liberation movements for people of color, um, and other disenfranchised peoples that go back to the 60s and even before that into all these other kinds of ideas about change. Don't want to get into all that. That could just be a
Although we
whole
could.
other. Well, there's a whole other podcast in that, and it could get just very arcane, you know. But we were all kids essentially who came of age, I think, around the turn of the millennium in into social movements that were losing.
Mm,
That we grew up in a period during which, you know, the 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 large portion of what was happening in the political realm was regressive, was reactionary. And it's interesting, to think about kind of how we go from a point in maybe, the mid 60s to the mid 70s during which these insurgent movements think that the revolution is around the corner.
mm.
And there's all these different types of visions for how we're about to get there. And people are arguing about that. But people agree, for the most part, if you're in these radical social movements of that time, that we're about to win. And instead, what gets ushered in, and people point to 1968 as this turning point in so many ways, or maybe this peak in so many ways, um, that from 1968 onwards, right, we start seeing this period that has variously been labeled the post-civil rights era, um, the sort of uh, era of revanchism or whatever you want to call it.
mm,
Um, but the sort of movements that like were able to win massive changes. You know, you can point from everything from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to maybe the peak, which is, you know, maybe the passage of, you know, Fair Housing Act, Civil Right, the Immigration Nationality Act, um, you know, to um, you know, all kinds of different types of wins, and literally all the way up until last year, seeing, you know, affirmative action being knocked down by a majority conservative um, Supreme Court, you know,
mm,
that we've been living in this sort of long um, undoing of that revolution.
mm,
And so that sort of sets a stage, you know, for us coming of age in the late 1990s, looking at sort of how do we understand the world, seeing the rapid expansion of the prison industrial complex, the defunding of education, the huge increase in policing and militarism all around the world, um, the removal of regulations on, you know, global capitalism, um, on and on and on and on, right? The undoing of fair housing, the resegregation of the U.S. I could just the list goes on and on and on.
totally.
And thinking about, well, how do we enter into this particular moment, and people being energized in local communities by fighting, you know, say the siting of juvenile jails,
Mm,
um, the increasing sort of military state that's happening in public schools, looking at the crisis forming around the climate questions, thinking about how do we actually deal with this, and seeing things like, you know, the uprising in Seattle, looking at you know, important local movements that youth are forming to fight back against the prison industrial complex and expanded policing, and trying to think about how to form an agenda in this particular political environment, and realizing that culture is the way that people are meeting up, right? People aren't meeting up through visions of a political takeover, revolutionary sort of political takeover. People are meeting up through hip hop.
mm,
People are meeting up through punk rock music. People are meeting up through fan groups, and thinking about um, how, you know, uh, how the storytelling that we have is giving us moments of opportunity and windows and portals into alternative futures. And so, you know, my particular trajectory is thinking about how that leads to, you know, the National Hip Hop Political Convention in 2004, and how that re-energizes young folks to participate in electoral politics,
mm,
and ultimately gets young people to elect, you know, a president. Um, and uh, and then seeing that, you know, culture has ways in which these portals to alternative futures, you know, actually occur. You know, Barack Obama didn't run on, you know, reversing DOMA and establishing same-sex marriage, but like during this 2008 campaign, there were a lot of artists on the ground who were putting together posters, you know, saying Obama hope change and same-sex marriage. Um, you know, alternative energy questions, like addressing the climate crisis. All of those things were not on his agenda, but people were putting it on his agenda because there were these youth movements that had expressed themselves through the culture, that
mm,
were allowing folks to be able to come together and to make those demands, and to move that. And arguably, you know, that's the beginning of moving into the decade of the 2010s, where there are insurgent social movements on everything from, Standing Rock, right?
mm,
Stopping the pipeline, which brings together indigenous worldviews with like uh, climate crisis questions, with environmental justice questions. Um, Obviously, Black Lives Matter is like the linchpin for all of this type of work, but there's also the Occupy movement as well,
mm,
raising the question of economic inequality and what's really happened with global capitalism. And then, then too, connecting that to the Me Too movement um, as well, which all of these find their expression through culture before they find their expression through um, an institutionalized sort of version of what we had in the 60s, which
mm,
are, sort of nonprofit uh, funded organizations who are who have become sort of the institutionalization of the revolution that everybody thought we were going to have in the 70s. Um, all these movements happen outside of that. And so it just reaffirmed to us that culture is really the main game. And even now, when we look at like the way that the Trump counter revolution, the Trump sort of restorationist kind of project has come together, it's being masterminded by people like Steve Bannon who are like, culture's upstream from politics.
mhm, mhm,
It's not politics that are upstream from culture. It's culture's upstream from politics. Um, and so having a theory of how the state should be uh, sort of responding to culture and enforcing culture from on high in everything from book bans to um, this sort of quote unquote anti quote unquote DEI, anti wokeness type of movement that's meant to sort of put to final rest the sort of restorationist agenda that first starts getting instituted in 1968, by the hard right, getting Richard Nixon elected and all that kind of stuff. Um, that's all like due to their theorizing that they have to win back the culture war.
mm,
So, I give you this sort of big fucking wide history to kind of talk about like this idea that we've had to pursue thinking about culture in an intentional kind of a way, in a purposeful kind of a way, in a
mm,
strategic kind of a way. And to add to that, that all the other side has to do is to restore white supremacy.
right.
What we've got to do is to be able to bring people to a new sense of what's possible. We have to expand the imaginary. So the burden is always upon us to actually do the harder work, to take people in a direction that they don't know necessarily yet that they want to go.
Mm,
Um, and I think that that's sort of what undergirds all of this work that we've been doing over the last, however many years. And this is just joining it to millennia of people who have been thinking about this in this kind of a way. Um, but to think about how we convince people, persuade people to join us in making a better world.
I love how I was like, "Let's, like, wind it back just a few years and talk origins of the butterfly lab," and you're like, "No, Kareem, we're gonna wind it back 60 years."
Well, not even 60 years. I mean, we can like talk about like the rest of the recovery of indigenous ideas and worldviews
Totally.
and knowledges in this particular moment, right? Which takes us back to Africa, it takes us back to Asia, right? It takes us back even to, sort of alternative ways of pre-capitalist ways of understanding the world, that come from Europe even as well. So like I think that that's really what this is ultimately about is to is to try to convince people of the world that they want to build, um, and that world draws upon all of these sort of ways of knowing that have been around for
Right.
not just 60 years, but like
Totally.
millennia. I mean, it sounds really weird and fanciful to kind of talk about it in that kind of a way, and almost like beyond kind of belief, but that's, I think, ultimately like where we kind of point back to in some ways. And of course, we've got to figure out like real practical ways to be able to behave within and change behavior within this worldview that's come to dominate in this moment, which is
Right.
sort of this, European global capitalist, uh, extractionist, individualist, isolationist type of worldview. So I don't know. So it gets big.
No, it really
Yeah.
does. It resonates a lot with a lot of conversations that I feel like I've been having, certainly over the last handful of years, but even before that, I mean, recently, obviously, we're all seeing how like the topic of conversation is just that like, the transnational right is just doing a way better job of like painting their vision for the future for the majority of people than we are. And I think it's really useful, I think, to contextualize it in the way that you just did, which is just like, yeah, the burden of proof is harder on us because
Mhm.
we have to show a world that doesn't exist yet and why that's irresistible. It makes me think a little bit about the Future State series that we made like, many years ago, right?
Yeah, totally.
We started that in 2008 and the idea was like, well, in 2008 you have Obama being elected and you also have this global financial crisis and people are both hopeful and fearful about the future. And so like storytellers want to try and make sense out of that by projecting into the future. And so we were trying to kind of comment on relevant, urgent themes of today, political and social themes of today, by extrapolating them into the future. But I think, and obviously, like, there's a rich tradition, as you just kind of alluded to, of like a lot of culture makers, particularly like science fiction being a particular example, um, trying to comment on the world we live in and where we're headed, the trajectory of society through that lens of the fantastic of science fiction. And I think, like, we tell these stories, like, hoping and thinking that they're gonna impact society and change people's minds and or open their minds and shift perspectives in a particular way. Um, but I think most culture makers that are doing that work, you're kind of like making an assumption based on like your own sort of like creative perspective or your gut or people you're talking to. And I think like just to kind of connect it back to Butterfly Lab, right? Like there's this long history of culture makers using culture to talk about the world and try and talk about their values on a broad, wide scale. Um, but we're kind of doing it almost on instinct. We're doing it from like gut level as opposed to necessarily sort of like a more scientific perspective in terms of the way that you guys did it within the Butterfly Lab. And so, like, talk to me about how this idea of like, yeah, we need to use culture, which is, as you said, we all know it's upstream of politics, use culture to influence like the political realities of our world. And the how of like Butterfly Lab being so different or incorporating a very different set of tools that I think most culture makers use, like, how did that kind of come about to think about some of those tangible, um, uh, research sets, data sets, and toolkits that you guys developed? Like, how did that idea kind of come into it beyond just the idea that, you know, you and all of your collaborators were like, okay, we want to invest in time, energy, resources into like a cohort of projects that are really intentionally designed to use culture to shift perspectives in important political ways. How did that take shape in the specific way that it did within the Butterfly Lab?
Um, well, okay, specifically for the Butterfly Lab, what happened was, I came to Race Forward in 2018. I've been working on cultural justice issues, pretty much for the previous, 2 decades, not necessarily knowing that cultural justice was what I was working on, not having the words for it until I really kind of began teaming up with a lot of other folks and falling into this sort of nascent cultural strategy movement that begins to take shape in the early 2010s. Um, and so I was part of a group called Culture Strike. I was one of the founders of this group called Culture Strike with Fabiana Rodriguez, a bunch of writers, a bunch of artists, photographers, filmmakers, um, poets, just all kinds of, and then of course musicians who are working together in a group called Soundstrike, um,
Mm,
and thinking about how practically to harness culture to draw attention to, at that particular point, what was happening around immigration in Arizona with the passage of SB 1070, which looking back now looks like a blueprint for Trump's, you know, national immigration agenda. Um, and uh, and so when I came in, there had been somebody who was working at Unbound Philanthropy named Ade Faseha, who was a program officer there, who came to me and was like, "Hey, I know I've been following you. I know you've been working on these questions of cultural strategy. I know you've been working on these questions of migration and immigration and refugees. Um, like, what if we brought the two together and figured out how to, move the immigrant rights movement towards a place where they're better able to deal with the culture, because a lot of the organizations had been thinking about and working on culture in a very limited kind of a way. The funders gave organizations monies to be able to think about work in terms of strategic communications, which is a model that was really based for a previous media landscape. Um, and people were not thinking in terms of narrative per se, but in terms of messaging,
Mm,
and thinking about messaging within this media landscape that was very limited and very centralized. And of course, now we live in a media landscape that's completely dispersed, um, and which is sort of run according to the rules of surveillance capitalism. So essentially, it came it in some ways what we were trying to do was to look at this new kind of landscape, to theorize kind of what we needed to offer to many of these organizations, to these on the ground organizers, and to artists, in order to be able to work in new kinds of ways, um, and to kind of look at the ways in which we had kind of been bypassed by the moment, in
mm,
which surveillance capitalists, you know, you know, in which uh, technologists um, had begun to collect all kinds of information from us, could
mm,
construct algorithms that would know us better than we thought we would know ourselves, um, and to move us all into, a place of becoming consumers of everything, including messages about immigration, and and ideas about immigrants, refugees, and migrants. Um, and so, the Butterfly Lab began sort of as an experiment in terms of thinking about, like, well, how do we get people to really understand narrative, and how to move people, not at the level of being somebody who is literally a yes no binary on
mm,
a particular message, but thinking about how we move them to the worldviews that are probably already there within their minds and their heads and their experiences, that actually activate a politics that can move us more towards the world that we all want to live in together,
mm,
right? Towards values that are expansive, that are inclusive, that are sustainable, that are mutual, um, and and so I think, what we were building on at the Butterfly Lab was basically a decade of folks working deep in culture, um, to to try to put together literally a toolkit, a set of tools that people might be able to use in order to rethink the way that they're they're understanding what their roles are, um, in bringing about, you know, change, and that's what the Butterfly Lab was meant to do.
mm. So you just mentioned the toolkit, which I think is also one of the most interesting aspects of the project, and certainly one that, I personally spent a lot of time with.
Yeah.
A good way. It was the first time that I really sort of thought about kind of story creation from a creative standpoint, like through the lens of like very tangible like outcomes.
Mhm.
Um and to have like sort of a framework and a step-by-step process to really follow in terms of the story creation. And so maybe you can talk a little about like what went into the creation of that toolkit. How did you know um, to sort of sequence things in the way that you did? What was the process of like kind of creating that? What were the inputs into the creation of that toolkit?
I think the breakthrough for Nayantara and I was coming up with the narrative pyramid, because then that allowed us to be able to explain to people in a really easy kind of a way, like here's actually how culture functions, and here's the different points at which we need to be able to move people. Um, and to be able to kind of explain that in that way allowed us to show how the strategic communications model was a model that was essentially ephemeral and not sticky. Um, that what we really needed to do was to be able to move people at the level of narrative, and really to move them, to understand how these narratives fit together into a larger set of values that define a worldview, which again I think is latent in everybody's way of kind of looking at the world. There's literally, I mean, I don't want to simplify it too much, but to say there's a worldview in which scarcity is the primary rule, and this particular worldview and this particular value of scarcity fits along with all these other types of things. Scarcity fits into narratives that are based on fear. Scarcity fits into narratives that are um, based in uh, um, this idea of competition
Mm,
or meritocracy. It fits into all of these different types of ideas that that actually activate us in a particular kind of a way
mm,
towards often towards reactionary politics. Not always, but often towards reactionary politics. If we can counter that with narratives of sort of expansiveness, right, of connection, of mutuality, for instance, that those would activate a different set of politics and a different set of points of view about a policy. And I think in every person we have these different conflicting types of values that are at work in any given type of moment. Um, and as you were talking about earlier, right, in 2008, right, these are moments where where different kinds of values could be activated, right? If there's a economic crisis, you can activate fear, right? But you could also activate generosity or mutuality, right? That could activate ideas of mutual aid
mm,
or assist that result in people creating modes of assistance for each other. Um, the idea that we're all in this together,
mm,
uh, as opposed to we're all fending for ourselves. And so we wanted to try to remind people of these types of ideas, which are not they're not foreign to the organizing that we do. But oftentimes we get caught up with the tactic, and the tactic becomes the strategy in of itself. Like you're given a hammer, right? And you just you just hit the nail, right? So that was the idea about the toolkit. Like, can we get people to understand all these other ways to be able to approach the problem of communicating what it is you need them to do? You need them to vote a certain kind of way on an issue,
mm,
right? But if everything gets kind of reduced to a certain kind of th- end, right, then you might lose sight of where it was you were trying to take people in the first place.
mm,
um, and uh, and so that became the basis of the toolkit. And there's any number of tools that you can put into the toolkit. I'd argue that our toolkit is like just one type of toolkit,
mm,
that all kinds of other folks can come and add other tools to that particular type of toolkit. But ultimately, if we get people to understand that the end is not just vote a certain way on this particular day, um, you know, that it's not a yes or no binary, that we have a long like way to go towards moving people in the direction that we want them to move to. And that if we're thinking about trying to align like our messaging in any given moment to a narrative, and sort of a deep narrative destination or a worldview that we want to take people to, then that gives us a different way of kind of understanding the work that we're doing in any given type of moment.
Mm. Yeah, it is really versatile. I was really impressed with just how applicable it seemed to a lot of different kinds of cultural projects, and, um yeah, and I know it's super accessible and is online, and I'll make sure that we link to it so folks can access it because it is something that I think can be used in a lot of different cultural organizing situations. Concurrently to developing the toolkit, you guys were also prototyping, like, I wanna say, like, a dozen projects, like, in the
Mhm.
first year of the lab, and so and I think that was all happening at the same time, if I understand correctly, and so, like, can you talk to me about, like, what were the kinds of projects you were looking at in that initial phase? How were you thinking about what you were trying to prototype? What are the spaces that you were operating in? Who are the folks that you were trying to engage with? Um, and then how did that kinda lead you into the phase of the lab where I and the 3 other folks kinda came in with a different kind of project.
I think I, I think in general, what we were trying to do was to look for people that were working in a wide variety of different types of scenarios and situations.
Mm,
So we wanted to get people who are working in the law. We wanted to get people who are working in policy. We wanted to get people who were working specifically just as artists. We wanted to get people who had been kind of thinking about the and different sides of the art. Like they could have been working from the art world. They could have been working from um, more pop culture. They could have been working in different types of spaces. And what we wanted to do was to really get people to meet each other. Right? We don't even have these types of. There's a way in which the nonprofit industrial complex has had everybody siloed,
mm,
and we all kind of get labeled and put into sort of a butterfly case, so to speak, right? So we're all these beautiful little butterflies, like on a pin with a little label on it, and we don't get to interact or literally crossbreed our ideas. You know what I mean? And so that in of itself was, I think, really eye opening for a lot of people. It
mm,
was eye opening for us, for sure. To have an artist who's working on this notion of open borders, and to have them in a room with somebody who is a lawyer who's working immediately on this issue of what's happening where in Texas, where the border has been closed
mhm,
by executive order, and or by a policy that's come down from ICE, and to have them being like, how do we work with each other? Like, we want to get people to the same place, right? To be more inclusive, to be more empathetic to the plight of refugees. Um, but one person has an issue in the immediate case, which is, how are you going to get asylum for these folks? And of course, the issues have changed dramatically since then, for to now. But you've got folks who are like, we've got to get these people like understood as potential asylees. And then on the other side, people are like we've got to get people to understand that borders are fluid and they're fixed by this like sort of construction of the nation state, right? And how do they even have a conversation together about what to do in the moment? So those are some of where some of the most generative types of things kind of came. And one thing I'll say is one of the lessons that we took from previous generations where there would be these types of debates and sectarian kinds of fights about what the proper line was and what the proper job of a revolutionary was to be.
mm,
Um, these conversations would have been had, on the sides of broadsheets. You know what I mean? And also have violent ends. But if we could get everybody in the room to say, like, hey, you're doing this, I'm doing that, we're all kind of in this together. That's something that narrative work allows us to be able to do, is
mm,
to be able to kind of understand also in some ways, like where it is that we can be the best in expanding that imaginary. Like you're pushing back the imaginary in this kind of a way, and you're pushing the imaginary back in that kind of a way, and we can figure out ways to work together. So that was one of the things that I think was one of the big takeaways from just year one
mm,
was that all of these different projects, they were very, very different. They all needed very different types of different kinds of things. I don't know that we were successful in being able to provide all of those folks with what they actually needed in that particular moment, but it allowed us to be able to understand, like, in general, like, what are the kinds of things that we can know? What are the things, the kind of things that would become informative? And so in year two, we got like really in the weeds about thinking about the kinds of audience research, so to speak, right? And
Mhm.
even that is a marketing term, right? But this is like how we're building um, constituencies for change, how we're building um, our our blocks of how we're turning people into change makers themselves, right? And even using the tools that surveillance capitalism has used to actually, you know, sell shit back to us, to sell our, our to make our to turn our desire to reduce our desires from freedom, having freedom or being free to, having the latest Blue Note record that reissue that's come out, right?
Right.
Which I am absolutely guilty of, and which happens every time I open up Instagram.
100%. 100%.
So, there it is, right? Like, how do we get people to desire freedom in the same way that they're desiring, you know, to be part of that next record club
Right.
that's coming down the pike?
Mm.
That's part of the job that we need to do, and we can't compete in the old kind of a way. We have to be able to use these types of things. We need the critique of that, and we also need to be able to figure out how we play on that new terrain.
Mm. One of the things that you said that really resonated with me a lot is like that bringing folks together across all these different sectors from like organizers to artists and folks that sort of traverse sort of the interstitium between some of those two spaces um has been that like that's one of the most important things that I feel like I took away from the program is like ever since then I've been really kind of like obsessed with like spending as much time with organizers that are working in the same issue areas that I am, or even just like interrelated areas, because I think some of the things that we take for granted are how interconnected a lot of the social goals are that we're pushing towards. But spending a lot of time with organizers, I think made it really clear to me this idea that like, like they're doing in a lot of cases on a one-on-one basis, like what culture makers are trying to do on a one on a million kind of basis, right? And so like and you can understand like how organizers are shifting from, like looking at like the work that like Turk was doing in our cohort, right? Like that deep canvassing work is like super just
Yeah.
one-on-one, hyper personal, but it really has direct bearings on like what we're doing, like telling a series of short stories set in aspirational futures, right? Like if we can have a similar kind of conversation that taps into something in the way that organizers do, like then possibilities are phenomenal. Uh,
Right.
so since then, I feel like I've tried to spend a lot of more time with organizers that are doing work like that, just to better understand like what are the stories that they're telling that are shifting people's perspectives, and then how do we kind of capture some of that magic in a bottle and like, kind of put it in a book. I'm I'm curious too because like, again, like you have a background in culture strategy, but you also like have a deep background as like a culture maker. And so I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit also about like how some of these ideas around strategy influence the way that you think about the art that you're making and the books you're writing. Um and the ways to sort of like what stories you want to tell. Like, I mean, I think your most recent book is like a really interesting example of that, right? Like, how does telling the story of Bruce Lee kind of fit into like the culture strategy work that you've been doing alongside your writing practice for so many years? And like, how does it maybe kind of make you think about like, what are the important stories to tell right now in this moment? Because I feel like all these things are kind of connected, right? Like what we feel like is like politically successful in terms of culture strategy. What is our specific cultural expression and piece of art that we're working on right now? And then also like what are the changing dynamics of the world that we're in that deepen us kind of further into a purpose and kind of inform what we want to work on and what we need to be working on.
Ooh, geez, Kareem, you ask such simple questions. I can. These are the absolute opposite of a yes no binary type of
I'm trying to tee
question.
you up to just like let it rip.
Look, okay, all right. So
Oh, let
so
it go.
some things to say. So I just got off tour. One of the great conversations I was able to have was with Walida Imarisha, who's an
Mm.
organizer in Portland, and who coined this amazing sentence that just sticks with me and is it just takes all kinds of different types of shapes for me and helps me to rethink my thinking all the time. But she wrote, "All organizing is science fiction."
I can't
Right?
tell you how often I use that quote. Do you remember when I first pitched you guys on
Yeah,
Futures and I brought in a copy of Octavia's Brood and, like,
yeah,
I was like, "Right here, like, organized
yeah.
science fiction." Like,
It's
Walida
right there. It's all right there. And then that means that all science fiction is organizing as well, right?
Mhm.
Right? So, right, because we're not saying one precedes the other. We're saying they are each other, they're one is the other, right? All organizing is science fiction and all science fiction is organizing. So that's one of the things that it made me think of in that particular type of moment as you're saying all that kind of stuff. Like in the creation of what we're doing, we're actually all organizing. And that takes us back to that point that I just made, which is like if we think of all of this stuff as organizing, right? If we think of organizers as organizing, but we also think of creators as organizing as well, like then that gives us a different way of kind of understanding what it is that the work is that we're doing, right? And if we're organizing folks, what are we organizing them towards, right? And I think that that's again like part of like what the lessons of this last decade are about. Um, and in terms of these resurgent social movements that came about uh and they even allow us to kind of think about the roles that we need to be able to play in this current movement, right? This current moment, I'm sorry, this current moment, um how we need to be in relationship to each other. So for me as a writer, like the Bruce Lee project came about decades ago, and it's weird that it's kind of taken the shape that it's taken because I finished really writing the book last year,
Mm,
um, for the most part, before the election, and yet it's kind of continued to take a different shape now in this political moment. Um, but the idea that I was thinking about in that particular moment last year was, why is it that we had this powerful narrative, stop Asian hate, stop AAPI hate,
mm,
um, that actually turned a large part of uh, our Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian communities reactionary, right? It triggered the fear narrative in them
mm,
as opposed to the sort of solidarity narrative in them.
mm,
Um, and then how does that relate to thinking about like what it is that we're trying to advance in terms of the very idea of identity itself? If violence is the thing that's making us all Asian American, because it didn't make us all Chinese, it made us all more Asian American,
mm,
um, then what does that narrative then point towards, right? And here's a perfect example of how the messaging gets in the way of what it is that we want to move and activate people towards. Like the stop portion of this actually turns people into saying, uh, well, no, it's about I, me, mine. It's about my folks, and
mm,
everybody's against us.
mm,
It activates the fear narrative. It activates this narrative that pushes us in the direction of isolating ourselves. Um, it becomes sort of this mechanism for which is, I think, it makes for a great story. Like the story of us against the world type of thing. But
mm,
it ultimately like leads us, towards uh negativity, towards death, right? It's what we've learned in hip hop time and again,
mm,
right? It's the Tupac story,
mm,
right? In a lot of ways, right? Um and uh and so, instead, like for me, when violence is occurring against us in the bottom of 2020, the bottom of our feeling most like vulnerable and victimized, that's when the image of Bruce Lee starts reappearing on the walls in Oakland Chinatown, San Francisco Chinatown,
mm,
all over the country on all our feeds. he's a symbol of strength. He's a symbol of pride. Obviously, he's a symbol of let's fight back. But what does he point to? And his life, his biography, always for me pointed back towards openness, uh, to inclusion, to solidarity, towards lifting people up, towards freedom. Um, like in his movies, in his first two movies, he plays a character who isolates himself, um, who has a community that loves him, that cares for him. In the first, it's the community of workers. And the second, it's his Kung Fu Kun. And in
Mhm.
both instances, he decides to go rogue, to go lone wolf, and he loses his community. Like the opponents, the villains in the movie, literally kill his community off,
Mm.
and that puts him into justice mode, justice seeking mode. But it's both those movies are tragedies. At the end of the movie, he's either killed in Fist of Fury or he's sent off to jail, um, as he is in Big Boss. The
Mhm.
Fist of Fury sort of ending is sort of um, similar to that, right? So he comes up with his own story for this third movie, Way of the Dragon, where he comes in from the outside to help this group of restaurant workers who are in a foreign country and who are being, victimized by a mob boss who literally wants to crush the restaurant, deport the immigrants,
Mm.
and to gentrify the neighborhood. Um, and he comes in to help them out. He teaches them how to fight. He literally organizes them, teaches them how to fight, and then he helps to defend them, and he's able to survive. In the end, he walks off and theoretically goes to the next, folks in the diaspora who are in need of
Next
help,
town
right?
over.
Right, and that's the story that Bruce writes. And so, that's the story of Bruce to me in a nutshell, and we could go so much deeper into that kind of thing, but I was like, like that's the story that I want to tell people.
Mm.
um, and then, of course, we move into this period that we're in now, and even more so, those themes of needing solidarity and how far does our solidarity expand,
Mm.
um, and what does it mean for us to think about an expansive solidarity as opposed to a solidarity that ends with just those who look like us. Um, that's even more important in this particular moment, right? Where the same folks who are all like, they're all against us are now like, look at the state coming to round us all up, like these are stories that point us towards having solidarities with other people who are getting rounded up, who are expressing their political views and seeing their book bans or being forcibly removed, to people who are immigrants who are actually legalized, who are getting deported, to families that are getting separated,
Mm.
to people who are being preyed upon by the police. Like that's who our solidarities could and should go to. So it's weird that the book is out now because in some ways it's just kind of helped to reinforce all of those types of things that I had been kind of writing about last year with no idea that we were going to be in this type of political situation that we're in.
Mm.
So again, like all of us become, all of us who are kind of expanding the imaginary, whether that's through science fiction or that kind of thing, we're all organizers. And through the stories that we write, the narratives that we ply, um, and the places that we want to take people with our stories, we are organizing people as well.
That's really cool. Like I mean, and also just the story around how the book evolved because it makes me think like, oh yeah, these like stories enter into the world like at the moment that they're supposed to, right? They enter into the world when they're needed.
Yeah.
And so your book seems like a really great example of that. I know we're short on time, and so I thought maybe we could just close with like, you know, again, sort of reflecting on your book coming out this year, like in this current political and social climate, like and reflecting on the experience of the Butterfly Lab and knowing, without saying anything specific, that there's more Butterfly Lab stuff happening, in the
Mhm,
future. Like,
mhm.
how are you thinking about like, when you talk to other culture makers, like, how are you thinking about, what is the assignment, like, in this current moment? You know, like, what's the role, what's the significance of folks making culture, like, particularly in a political climate like this, where things are so much more dire than they were 5 years ago, for so many communities, not just
So many
ours.
communities. Yeah, I think it's just continuing to be able to tell the stories that we wanna tell, you know? I thought it was interesting, like, just to see kind of like, and you and I talk about this all the time, right? But we're just looking at the movie list of movies that have come out, like, in the past couple of months, and looking at all of these movies, um, and all of them have kind of been duds, right? And the one sort of big success is this movie that actually takes on ICE directly, right?
Mhm,
One battle after another. And it's not to say that's the most perfect movie in many ways, but it's literally one that is positing, revolution in the form of an underground railroad that these, anti-immigration enforcement, these anti-ICE activists and organizers have been able to create, and drawing explicit parallels to movements for liberation, Black liberation movement in particular. Um, I thought that was really interesting, and I think that that's what people want in this particular moment. People want those kinds of narratives to be able to kind of help them think about the current moment. So it's just continuing to do the work that we're doing. It's not to be daunted um by this, or to imagine that I mean, it's to point out that we all, like, in a classic way, right, been shut out again because of all this anti-wokeism and the sort of collaborationism, the sort of Vichy regime that all of these universities and studios and media companies have become, right? Um, but to like just continue to be able to network and do our work and build the structures that we need to build, because we saw how fast it turned, um, and we could see again, if we look back, how fast it turned even in the last decade, you know, um, from Black Lives Matter being a hashtag to overnight becoming a global movement, um, and what folks did in terms of building the structures that they built like none of that structure building has gone away. None of those storytellers have gone away. If anything, we have more stories to tell and more lessons that we've learned in that time. And um, yeah, so just we just have to kind of continue to persevere. Like if we think about the movement from Lewis Powell to Steve Bannon,
mm.
right? That's like a 50-year arc. Um, and there's ways in which we can steel ourselves, I think, by thinking about things in the long run. We've continued to build through all of these moments of reactionary politics. Um, and we've had these kinds of breakthroughs, but I still believe that we will win.
Well said, Jeff. I appreciate you taking some time to chop it up with me, man. It's always good talking to you.
I love this. Thank you so much, Kareem.
Um,
I got to reverse the tables at some point and ask you for the answers to these same questions, because I know you've thought about this so deeply and you have
I
so.
mean, this is what we do, right? This is what
Yeah.
we do. This is why I love talking about this stuff, it's like we're just immersed in it. But I'm so grateful for all the work that you're doing, both as an artist and also as a strategist. I mean, like I was saying before, like the Butterfly Lab has been so influential to the way that I kind of think about how I tell stories, how I write books, how I make films, how like Utopia Studio is doing like all the work that we're doing, and just like that tight relationship between thinking about political organizing and storytelling is just like so foundational. And so I'm just really grateful to have gone through the program and been able to work so closely with you on developing Muslim futures, and looking forward to a lot more to come, my friend.
It's my honor and pleasure, man, to be able to work alongside you. So thank you.